Thank you so much, Ted. The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize Chairman Royce when he comes in for as much time as he may consume. I will then would love to recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We're also pleased that during this hearing we will be joined by Chairman Rogers of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces and other members of that subcommittee who may join us as well. They have jurisdictional concerns related to the matter before us today, and without objection, I will also be prepared to recognize any member of that subcommittee seeking recognition if and when they are present. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days in which to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. We are less than 3 weeks away from the supposed June 30th nuclear deal deadline. This dangerous deal will open the pathway for Iran to become a nuclear threshold state, will legitimize this pariah nation on the international scene, and will help fund the regime's other illicit behavior. And despite the ongoing nuclear negotiations and our repeated efforts to call attention to the shortcomings of the framework agreement, Iran continues to spread its terror across the globe, stoke sectarian tensions across the Middle East, destabilize the region, and expand its hegemonic ambitions, now controlling the Arab capitals of Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a, oppress and persecute religious minorities. Iran continues to be one of the world's worst human rights violators. Iran continues to violate international sanctions and even reportedly violate the terms of the Joint Plan of Action and now the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Framework Agreement. And Iran's regime continues to make advances on its ballistic missiles program. There are many glaring omissions from the Obama administration and the P5+1 nuclear negotiations with Iran that have caused many to rightly worry and call this possible deal weak and dangerous. But perhaps the biggest failure of these negotiations was to limit them to just the nuclear profile and omit all of the other illicit activities, most notably the continued progress on the ballistic missile program. Just last week, the Pentagon reported that Iran continues to make technological advances on its missile program despite the ongoing negotiations and despite the sanctions, both multilateral and unilateral, for doing so. The mere fact that Iran continues to make these advances on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and other ballistic missiles, weapons that have very little practical use outside of delivering a nuclear payload, simply belies the notion that Iran's nuclear program is intended for peaceful uses. Taken with reports that Iran's nuclear stockpiles have actually grown during the negotiations, this demonstrates the regime's clear and undeniable intent to develop a nuclear weapon. For the sake of negotiations, Iran's ballistic missile program is off limits. But for the sake of lifting the sanctions on Iran at the UN Security Council, everything is nuclear related, as the administration aims to lift as many sanctions as possible, in turn giving Iran more access to billions of dollars. This makes no sense, and it is dangerous. So what impact will a potential nuclear deal have on Iran's ballistic missile program, on our U.S. national security, and the stability of the region? Well, if the Iranian regime gets this reported $50 billion signing bonus, a good portion of that money will get invested right back into Iran's illicit activities, including its ballistic missile program. As the UN panel of experts reported last week, we're already having a difficult time maintaining these sanctions, as many nations are looking the other way on sanctions in expectations that they will get lifted. When the sanctions are lifted, Iran will go back to working with its allies, the regimes of North Korea, Syria, Russia, and China, to acquire what it needs to further advance its ballistic missile program. Iran and Syria have obtained ballistic missiles and technology from North Korea, a nexus that the Obama administration has failed to address head-on by not prioritizing INCSA sanctions against these dangerous regimes. With ballistic missiles already able to hit parts of Europe and target our ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, Iran will soon be able to create more sophisticated ballistic missiles that are more capable and will be able to advance its ICBM program that would be capable of hitting us here in the U.S. Iran has the most extensive ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, with the intelligence community assessing that Iran has a substantial inventory of medium-range ballistic missiles, including the Shahab, and its variants. Iran's space program is a cover for its continued program on its ICBM program, as the two would share many similarities. If Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs go unchecked, it will give Tehran the ability to continue to perfect their ballistic missile program to be used once the nuclear deal expires. We've already seen Russia lift its suspension on the sale of S-300 missile systems to Iran. These S-300s will give Iran a new capability to defend its nuclear facilities or its ballistic missile platforms. The ink wasn't even dry yet on the framework agreement, and Russia moved in to take advantage because Putin surely expects the Iranian sanctions to be lifted. This nuclear deal is not only the legitimization that Iran has sought on the international stage, it is also the green light that it needs to continue to pursue nuclear weapons and the platforms with which they would be delivered. Done with my opening statement, I would like to ask Mr. Deutsch if it's okay if I could recognize Chairman Royce. Thank you so much for joining us, Chairman Royce, and Mr. Deutsch is always a gentleman. Mr. Royce is recognized for as long as he would like.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Appreciate it. Appreciate you holding this hearing. And in many ways, Iran's missile program has been a case study in how the Obama administration has handled these nuclear negotiations with Iran from the beginning. And it's a case study in that it again reflects a situation where the United States has backed off in terms of the requirement. When the negotiations kicked off, the White House was insistent, and I'm going to use their words now, insistent that the Iranians have to deal with matters related to their ballistic missile program. After all, the UN Security Council resolutions prohibit Iran's work on ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons. So, here's the situation we're in. Iran's supreme leader, after he heard these remarks, declared that this is a stupid, idiotic expectation, unquote, and he called it the main duty of all military officials in Iran to, quote, mass produce ICBMs. Soon, State Department negotiator Wendy Sherman was telling the committee, as a result, that UN missile sanctions are not about ballistic missiles per se. They're about nuclear-armed missiles. So the whole argument changed. The problem is that ballistic missiles are the most reliable way to deliver nuclear warheads. Indeed, as we will hear this morning, ballistic missiles are not a separate and secondary issue, but part and parcel of Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure. That's why Congress has targeted Iran's missile program with sanctions right alongside its nuclear program. And we had intended that to be part of this agreement. One witness calls the development of a long-range missile program a litmus test for a country's nuclear intentions, asserting that no country that has not aspired to possess nuclear weapons has ever opted to sustain a lengthy and expensive missile program. Iran is pressing ahead with both, Remember that when Libya and South Africa renounced nuclear weapons, by the way, in the case of applying sanctions on South Africa, that's one of the ways we got them to capitulate. When they made that announcement, they also gave up the missile programs that went along with them. That's a long way from the, to quote the Ayatollah, the mass produce directive given to the military, a long way from that attitude of the supreme leader there. Recently, this committee heard about the negotiating gains the Obama administration will need to make over the next few weeks to get an agreement that has a chance of being meaningfully verified. Given the relative ease in detecting nuclear programs, missile restrictions could be a key source of verification in any sort of agreement with Iran. As one witness recalls, Reagan's trust but verify didn't rely on tracking nuclear fuel stockpiles or centrifuges, but instead on counting Soviet delivery systems. And how close is Iran to achieving a nuclear warhead? Iran continues to stonewall the IAEA on key questions, all 12 key questions, including missile warhead design, that its inspectors began pressing for over 3.5 years ago now. So we just don't know. Unfortunately, in the run-up to the June 30th deadline, the Obama administration has shown no interest in working to stop Iran's ICBM program, instead boldly claiming that its agreement will cut off every path to a nuclear weapon. But as one witness asks, if the agreement effectively blocks Iran's path to nuclear weapons, why would Iran continue to work on a costly weapons system that could never be effectively armed? And with the vast sanctions relief that is coming to Iran, there will be billions more for Iran to invest in and improve that ICBM program, which is, by the way, an increasing threat to U.S. forces and partners in the region and eventually to our allies in Europe and here at home. And if you doubt that they're going to use the sanctions relief on that program, I would just ask anyone to explain how it is that over this last month we've seen the reports about Iran transferring now the precision missiles that they've developed to Hezbollah, so that now Hezbollah, that already has 80,000 rockets and missiles, thanks to, the generosity of Iran, is going to go to 100,000, is going to have precision-guided missiles, and at the same time, a new generation of missiles are being transferred to Hamas, by the way, along with the statement by Iran that they're going to rebuild the tunnels for Hamas. This telegraphs the intentions, the attitude and the intentions of this regime. And their intentions are clearly there to mass produce ICBMs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well put. Thank you so much, and we're honored that you would join us, Chairman Royce. And now, thank you for your kindness, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for joining us today, and thanks to our esteemed witnesses for being here as well. We're 20 days out from the imposed deadline to reach a deal to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. The world has rightfully so been focused on the nuclear issue for the better part of 2 years. But in that time, while Iran's diplomats sit face-to-face with the P5+1 negotiators, the regime has continued to engage in dangerous activities, everything from human rights abuses against its own people to the transfer of arms in violation of UN Security Council resolutions to material support for the Assad regime to supply Hezbollah with weapons to the continued development of its ballistic missile program, a program, I might add, that has been subject to United Nations Security Council resolutions in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2010. Much of this program has relied on illicit transfer of technology and supplies from other pariah states like North Korea. Beginning in the early 1990s, Iran received help from Russia and China. Vestiges of those relationships may remain. It's unclear to what extent Iran's program has become increasingly self-reliant in the face of international sanctions. However, aspects of the Iran-North Korea nexus continue to come to light. Just recently, press reports surfaced detailing an Iranian dissident group's claim that a delegation of North Korean scientists were in Iran for the third time this year. And while those reports remain unconfirmed, the State Department did say that it would take any such reports seriously. The United States National Intelligence Estimate of 1999 predicted that Iran could test an ICBM in the year 2015. Now, thankfully, it continues to appear that Iran remains far from ready to meet that goal. But given the opaque nature of its program, it's difficult to assess just how far it has progressed. And while Iran's leaders have been known to make exaggerated claims, it's impossible to leave anything to chance when it comes to this regime. We do know that Iran has successfully developed short and medium-range ballistic missiles, and we know that Iran continues to work on space launch vehicles, likely as a cover for its aim to develop an ICBM. Many experts wonder what practical use could this regime possibly have for these advanced capabilities, if not to carry a nuclear warhead. Iran's short and medium-range capabilities, if precise, have the potential to threaten our regional allies, or potentially Europe, as President Obama warned in 2009. And while Iran may not be interested in regional state versus state conflict at this time, it does not mean that their non-state proxies would hesitate to use these dangerous weapons. It is already estimated that Hezbollah has 100,000 missiles and rockets capable of striking anywhere in Israel. As Iran continues to develop its missile capabilities, Hezbollah is the natural beneficiary. Should Israel encounter another conflict with Hezbollah, precision missiles could do incredible damage. Last year, the Times of Israel reported on a story from Iran's semi-official Fars news agency, which claimed that IRGC delivered a new class of missiles to Hezbollah with ranges of 250 to 350 kilometers, and which can fit a 500-kilogram warhead. An IRGC brigadier general told the news agency that the new missiles will allow Hezbollah to hit any place in Israel, quote, including targets in the south of the occupied territory, close quote. He was also quoted as saying the Israeli nuclear facility at Dimona is an easy target. And Israeli missile experts quoted in the same report claim that this class of missiles would be 5 times more accurate than the Scuds Hezbollah had fired in the past. Further, with reports of Iran mending its relations with Hamas, have any new advanced missile transfers taken place between these two bad actors, or with Iran's more closely tied Gaza proxy, Islamic Jihad? I would note that this is yet another reason that our joint missile defense cooperation with Israel receives such broad support from Congress and the administration. Iran's unwavering support for the brutal Assad regime also calls into question whether Iran and Syria have continued cooperation on ballistic missiles. I also worry that even the mere perception of advanced ballistic missile capabilities could embolden Iran's behavior. However, Iran does not currently possess advanced missile defense systems which could deter it from any regional provocations. This is all the more reason that it's imperative that Russia does not proceed with the sale of the S-300 missile defense system to Iran, and the administration must continue to make clear that that sale cannot proceed. We must also continue to increase our cooperation and interoperability with our Gulf partners to ensure that they have adequate defense systems against these threats. And as we increase our presence in the Gulf, I'd ask our panel, what threat do Iran's current ballistic missile capabilities pose to our own assets in the region? So to circle back where I began, we've been focused on the nuclear issue, but whether or not a deal is reached at the end of this month should have no bearing on the continued international sanctions on Iran's missile development. I was disturbed by a UN report made public yesterday that despite Iran having a known illicit procurement network with continued activities often reported in the press, no new sanctions violations have been reported to the UN by any member countries. Furthermore, the Associated Press reported this morning that the United States might consider ballistic missile sanctions to be nuclear-related sanctions, therefore creating the possibility that these two could be lifted in a nuclear deal. That is extremely disturbing. I'd just like to quote the article, Madam Chairman, in which officials say the administration can meet its obligations because of how it interprets nuclear sanctions. For example, they say measures designed to stop Iran from acquiring ballistic missiles are nuclear-related because they were imposed to push Iran into the negotiations. Also, they say sanctions that may appear non-nuclear are often undergirded by previous actions conceived as efforts to stop Iran's nuclear program. We know that our sanctions regime is complex, but now to say that ballistic missile sanctions were simply a tool to get Iran to the negotiating table, as was suggested by an unnamed administration official, would be a grave mistake. And to the article's anonymous administration official, I would say that these ballistic missile sanctions must remain in place and they must be enforced. With or without nuclear weapons, this remains an extraordinarily dangerous regime, and allowing it to develop advanced missile technology risks continued destabilization of the entire Middle East. I look forward to our witnesses' views on whether they share my serious concerns, and I yield back. Thank you.
I
Madam
share
Chairman.
them. Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. I'm now pleased to recognize the members for 1-minute opening statements, and we will begin with Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you for having this important hearing on the ballistic missile threat in Iran. Your leadership for America makes a difference, along with Chairman Ed Royce, and I'm very, very grateful to see the bipartisan support that we have this morning on the concerns about the threats to the people of throughout Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeastern Europe. Their capabilities with potential nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles threaten our allies in the region, especially Israel, with the regime's goal of death to Israel, death to America. The murderous philosophy of the Iranian regime has not changed since Iran's leaders murdered 241 U.S. Marines in Beirut in 1983. The American people know the Iranian government, which subjugates its own people, cannot be trusted. The President continues to ignore the glaring realities of the threat that Iran poses to American families and to neighboring countries of the Persian Gulf. I believe a nuclear Iran, along with long-range ballistic missiles, would be catastrophic, and the President should change course. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Higgins of New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The nuclear negotiations with Iran have focused primarily on material and infrastructure. And when you look at the fact that Iran has the largest and most diverse ballistic missile program in the entire Middle East, you can't ignore the fact that that is a fundamental piece of the nuclear infrastructure, as it's the most reliable means to deliver a nuclear weapon. So I think it's very, very important that this committee delve deeply into this issue and take advantage of the expertise that we have here so that we can refute any efforts to decouple these two issues, because I think any review of the ballistics missile program, which dates back prior to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when in fact it was Israel and Iran that collaborated in the first ballistics missile program. Iran had provided the money, and Israel had provided the technology when the United States refused to sell them Lance missiles. So there's a lot to study here, and I'm hopeful that the panel can help the committee determine, a course of action here that is constructive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Mr. Trott is recognized.
I want to begin by thanking the chairwoman and ranking member for holding this timely hearing. As we approach the June 30th deadline, it's important for Congress to be as informed as possible regarding Iran's stockpile of weapons. Most experts agree that Iran has the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, most of it coming from another rogue country, North Korea. Senior U.S. intelligence officials have consistently warned about Iran's potential to deliver weapons of mass destruction with these missiles, yet when the administration got to the bargaining table, they made concessions and decided not to include the ballistic missile program in the joint plan of action. As recently as last week, the Pentagon reported that Iran continues to develop ballistic missile technology that will undoubtedly be used for nuclear weapons. If Iran were to successfully engineer a nuclear warhead at one of their various covert facilities, the ballistic missiles would enable them to attach a warhead and put our closest ally, Israel, at significant risk. Even without a nuclear warhead, Iran's arsenal of ballistic missiles can be used as an intimidation tool against vulnerable countries in the region. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' testimonies today, and I, for one, do not believe Iran will change, and America projecting weakness will not create stability and only exacerbates a problem that already threatens our security and the security of our friends. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Meng of New York. Oh, Mr. Connolly, a former Senate staffer.
You knew that.
That's why I overlooked you.
Well,
You know how we treat our staffers.
I know, but I've converted it. I'm a house guy.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think, thank you for the panel for being here. This is really a critical conversation. And there are some questions I hope we get answers to during the course of this conversation. What is your assessment of the nature of the threat? How serious is it? And what's the time frame associated with it? What's our power to deter that threat? we give flowery speeches up here and passionate speeches, but sometimes we don't accept the fact that America's ability to influence things and control things is limited. What are the incentives on Iran to desist? Do we have any, and how well might they work? What does it mean in the region in terms of escalation? If they develop a ballistic missile capability that's precise, what pressure does this put on others in the region, like the Saudis, to do likewise? And then finally, how well is this issue addressed or will be addressed in the proposed agreement, nuclear agreement with Iran? Thank you, Madam Chairman. I look forward to the answers.
Thank you, and I apologize again, Mr. Connolly. And,
No problem.
And I know that Mr. Brooks and Mr. DeSantis will wait for the question and answer period, so we will go to Mr. Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I appreciate you having this important hearing. Also to Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Deutsch. We have a very distinguished panel today of witnesses. As a former Army military intelligence officer stationed in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, while Lieutenant General Flynn was there, I thank you for your service, and it's good to have you here. This is a very timely topic because I think for constituents like mine and all across America, if an announcement is made that a deal is reached, Americans are going to want to make a decision for themselves as to whether or not it was a good deal or a bad deal, and they want to know more as to what exactly to look for. So hopefully in the dialogue today and the questions and answers, this provides an opportunity not just for members of Congress to understand more of what to look for in analyzing a potential deal with Iran, but also assisting our constituents so that they understand just how real this threat is and what is absolutely necessary to tackle these challenges. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Ms. Meng of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for calling this important hearing, and to all our distinguished witnesses for being with us today. Iran's development of its ballistic missile program, its acquisition of new SME batteries, its widespread support for terrorism, and its arming of Hamas and Hezbollah with potent new weapons, amongst many other nefarious activities, pose serious threats to the security of America and our allies. Yet all of these issues are outside the scope of the nuclear negotiations, and if they're going to remain such, then we should support our friends in ways that are also outside the scope of the negotiations. The U.S. should consider transferring massive ordnance penetrators, otherwise known as the 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs, and the planes to deliver them to Israel. In the face of the grave Iranian threat, let us provide adequate means of deterrence to Israel, our most trustworthy friend and ally in the Middle East. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Meng, and I'd like to thank the gentleman from Alabama who was here with us for the opening statements, Mr. Rogers, Chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee, for being with us for the start of the hearing. Thank you so much to all of our members, and now I'm pleased to recognize our panelists. First, we're pleased to welcome General Michael Flynn. General Flynn served in the United States Army for 33 years, and almost 1 year ago retired from his previous post as Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Thank you, General, for being with us and for your distinguished and meritorious service to our nation. Second, we welcome Ambassador Robert Joseph. He is a senior scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy. Previously, Ambassador Joseph served as the United States Special Envoy for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Next, we welcome Dr. David Cooper, who is the James Forstall Chair of the U.S. Naval War College, Department of National Security Affairs. Dr. Cooper has served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Director of Nonproliferation Policy. And last, we welcome back a good friend of our subcommittee, Dr. Anthony Kordsman, the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Dr. Kordsman serves as Director of Intelligence Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as well as the Director of Policy and Planning at the Department of Energy. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Your prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Please feel free to summarize. Thank you. General, we will begin with you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman. And Madam Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the Joint Committee, and I really do appreciate all of your statements. I think you really, truly understand the challenges that we're facing. Thanks for the opportunity to present my views on Iran's missile capabilities and how they impact regional as well as global issues now and in the future. These will directly and negatively impact the United States national security unless we develop a long-term strategy for our nation. There's just no way around it. Our closed 20th century bureaucratic system appears unable to adapt to the rapid and complex changes and threats we face in the 21st century, especially those occurring throughout the Middle East and the wider trans region. These problems are exacerbated from an ever-expanding influence by the following. Number one, the negative behavior and expanding influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Number two, the increasing complexity in Iraq and Syria with absolutely no end in sight and no clear U.S. policy. Number three, the new Middle East struggling to be born, and if we are not careful, the United States will be left out of the growth of this region, and our security at home will be placed at further risk. Number four, the unfinished revolutions in places such as Yemen and parts of Africa and our ongoing transition in Afghanistan are all being taken advantage of by Iran, ISIS, and al-Qaeda. Number five, the resurgence of Russian and Chinese influence in the region, especially in the nuclear energy acquisition and development arenas, weapons proliferation, and economic dominance, all clearly impacting the security of our country. Not only do these impact our security at home, but they also impact our allies and friends in the region, most important, the State of Israel. Specifically focusing on the expanding Iranian missile program or missile development program and failing to acknowledge the frequent warnings from our intelligence community, especially defense intelligence, regarding the hegemonic behaviors of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iran's missile program is growing far stronger. Before I address a few solutions about what to do about their missile program, I want to offer some things that I know, things I believe, and things that I don't know but suspect, and there are many in my full statement that I provided to the committee. And number one, to begin with, the nuclear deal that will likely be concluded this summer suffers from severe deficiencies, as you have all highlighted. Number two, Iran has every intention to build an ICBM and a nuclear weapons program. Number three, Iran's stated desire to destroy Israel is very real. We have to take that very seriously. Number four, Iran killed or maimed thousands of Americans and Iraqis during our fight in Iraq during the period of 2003 to 2011, and despite our joint efforts to win the fight in Iraq, this has all now been squandered. Number five, the ability to have real eyes on the state of Iranian nuclear development to include their missile program is nearly impossible. Six, Iran's nuclear program has significant and not fully disclosed military dimensions, including the warhead miniaturization blueprints. Number seven, I believe that Iran's overarching strategic goals of enhancing its security, prestige, and regional influence give it the ability to build missile-deliverable nuclear weapons. Number eight, I believe that Tehran would choose ballistic missiles as its preferred method of delivering nuclear weapons. Number nine, I know Iran possesses a substantial inventory of theater ballistic missiles capable of reaching parts of southeastern Europe today. Number 10, I know Iran is developing increasingly sophisticated missiles and improving the range and accuracy of its other missile systems. So it is clear that the nuclear deal is not a permanent fix, but merely a placeholder. The 10-year time frame only makes sense if the administration truly believes the Iranian regime will change its strategic course. Just as the spiraling down of the entire region is unlikely to change, believing Iran will change its strategic course is also wishful thinking. As the Washington Post editorialists have said, regime change in Tehran is the best way to stop the Iranian nuclear weapons program. The same applies to their missile arsenal, which is of high quality and growing. Even today, their missiles cover most of the Middle East, and the next generation will include ICBMs capable of attacking the American homeland. Just look at the cooperation with North Korea, China, and Russia. Connect those dots and you get the outline of a global alliance aimed at the United States and our friends and allies. Russian assistance, North Korean cooperation, and deep involvement by the Chinese and Iran are all part of a broader pattern. And finally, the U.S. intelligence community's record in tracking clandestine nuclear weapons programs has been decidedly mixed. For instance, the U.S. had suspected for well over a decade that North Korea had a uranium enrichment program, but did not learn about its centrifuge plant at Yongbyon until the plant was actually shown visibly to a delegation of former U.S. officials in 2010. The U.S. did not learn about the reactor that North Korea was building in eastern Syria, the Al-Kabar site, until it was close to completion in 2007. The U.S. intelligence community did not become aware until nearly 4 years later that Iran had apparently suspended its structured weaponization program in 2003. The U.S. did not learn about Iran's enrichment plants at Natanz or Fordow until several years after work on each had commenced, albeit several years before each became operational. Other examples include Iraq prior to 91, South Africa in 1993, and the AQ-CON network operating for well over a decade. Moreover, a recent Defense Science Board study of nuclear monitoring and verification technologies concluded that technologies and processes designed for current treaty verification and inspections are inadequate to future monitoring realities, such as identifying small or nascent nuclear programs. This seems to imply that creative missile and nuclear proliferation would enjoy an advantage in the cat-and-mouse game that they are playing with the United States and the international community. There are a number of things that the international community can do. For instance, immediately direct Iran to open up all of its facilities, scientific, military, and current nuclear facilities for international inspections. 2 would be the U.S. must take a more active role in the region for what will be a race for nuclearization, preferring energy development over weaponization. Number 3, provide and/or demand greater authorities for all elements of U.S. national power to defeat the Islamic radicals we now call the Islamic State. Put them out of business. 4, seek and appoint leaders regionally, internationally, and right here at home. Give them the right and appropriate authorities that can actually accomplish the strategic objectives that we seek. Immediately recognize, fully support, help organize, and assist those regional partners create an Arab NATO-like structure and framework. Help build an Arab army that is able to secure their regional responsibilities. Clearly define and recognize that we face a very radicalized element in the likes of Islamic extremism, Sunni and Shia. The administration's refusal to state what we can plainly see is beyond irresponsible and ranges on being dangerous for the long-term security of the United States. So what will the overall threat environment look like with regard to Iran and its expansion of its missile program? We should expect a far more aggressive Iran as it relates to the Gulf, both overtly and covertly, and one that will likely remain militarily engaged for the foreseeable future. While the sectarian angle is likely to limit Iran's ability to support Sunni proxies and thereby limit their ability to project power, the ISIL crisis has created a significant cadre of Shia jihadists that can and will support Iran's policies through means fair and foul. If Iran is able to contain and defeat ISIL and subjugate through proxies large portions of Iraq's Sunni population, we should expect a whole host of initiatives intended to limit and eliminate Iranian influence by both state and private actors, as is now occurring in Yemen.
General, if we could ask you to wrap it up.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I'll wrap it up here. My bottom line is that I am assuming that the nuclear deal is going to be done. And I think what we have to realize practically is that we have a country that we're dealing with, that the rest of the region, and the reasons why we've been dealing with them, the rest of the region has lost trust and faith in the United States of America. And that's very real. And I think the latest GCC summit was a real example. It was a leaderless summit for a very specific reason. And it was because the region just doesn't trust us. And actually, the region is more concerned about Iranian hegemonic behavior and gaining massive influence in the entire region than they are right now about Iran developing a nuclear weapon. Now, the development of a nuclear weapon and its ballistic missile component is something that I firmly believe is going to happen. And we just don't have that kind of track record in the pack for tracking that. So, Madam Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to make some statements here, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General, and you honor us with your presence. Thank you. Ambassador.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Deutsch, other distinguished members. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. In my prepared statement, I highlight a number of observations about Iran's ballistic missile threat. Here, I would just reinforce the point that Iran's ballistic missiles are tools of coercion designed for strategic effect. And as such, I would emphasize the nexus between Iran's ballistic missiles and its nuclear program. In a strategic context, a nuclear front end would add tremendously to the coercive effect of Iran's missiles. In an operational context, nuclear warheads would be the primary and, in my view, the only feasible payload for its longer-range missiles. And for these reasons, I believe it's analytically flawed to assess the missile threat in isolation from the nuclear negotiations. The stated goal of the P5+1 has evolved from denying Iran a nuclear weapons capability to temporarily extending the breakout time, a change that recognizes Iran as a nuclear weapons threshold state. So even in the unlikely circumstance that all U.S. negotiating goals are met, after the restrictions are lifted in 10 or more years, Iran would again possess the capacity to break out within a few months or even weeks. And that's the best case. In fact, the missile-nuclear relationship is critical in any nearer-term breakout scenario. For this reason, failure to limit ballistic missiles must be considered one of several central flaws in the emerging agreement. One argument used to justify excluding missiles is that if Iran's nuclear weapons capability is precluded by the agreement, the threat of a nuclear-tipped missile goes away. There are a number of assumptions on which this argument is based. It assumes that permitting a large-scale enrichment capability is compatible with the goal of denying Iran a nuclear weapon. It assumes that the 12-month breakout time is meaningful. It assumes effective verification. And it assumes that the international community will respond to cheating before Iran can mate a nuclear weapon to a missile. In my view, none of these assumptions holds up under scrutiny. Any agreement that allows Iran to continue to build its missile force while permitting it to maintain and, in fact, expand its nuclear capability will have severe negative consequences for the United States and our friends and allies. The threat to U.S. forces, to the U.S. homeland, to our NATO and Gulf allies, and to Israel will increase, not decrease, under the anticipated agreement. Another consequence of a bad agreement is the increased prospect for proliferation. One likely result will be decisions by other states to acquire a similar capability. These states, Saudi Arabia, perhaps Turkey, perhaps Egypt, and others, will want to ensure that they are not one step behind Iran, unleashing the proliferation dynamic. And an agreement that effectively provides a stamp of approval for Iran's nuclear activities will only give encouragement to other proliferators. Finally, because missiles are excluded at Iran's insistence, the message to other rogue states will be that we are not serious about imposing costs for missile proliferation. This could be a further incentive for those states seeking weapons of mass destruction to acquire ballistic missiles as a means of delivery. For Iran, it could encourage even closer cooperation with North Korea on missile technology and perhaps in the nuclear weapons field. With tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief, Iran will have access to more resources for more missiles, for other weapons, and for more terrorist activities. A bad agreement will result in a less stable and more dangerous world. I have 4 recommendations for congressional action. 1, if there is an agreement, if one is reached, vote on it and reject it if it is a bad agreement. I think the metrics are clear. Just ask yourself, does the agreement deny Iran a nuclear weapons capability? Does the agreement extend the breakout time in a meaningful way? Is the agreement verifiable? Is there a phased relief of sanctions, and are there guaranteed snapback provisions? And I think for each of these questions, the answer is clearly no. Second, to the extent that it can be done, tie incremental sanctions relief to the fulfillment of Iran's commitments. Third, establish a Team B of nonpartisan experts to assess Iran's compliance. And 4, move forward with funding for missile defenses against the emerging Iranian nuclear-armed ICBM-class missile threat. Let me just sum up by saying that I come at these issues from a non-proliferation perspective. In my view, if there is an agreement along the lines that has been described by the White House and by the Iranian leadership, I believe it will represent perhaps the single greatest strategic mistake in the national security area in the past 35-plus years of my career. And this includes some real blunders. Desert One in 1980, the North Korea Agreed Framework in 1994, and more recently, Russia Reset and the Syria CW Red Line debacle. There's no doubt that some will describe the agreement as historic. You can expect that from the White House, you can expect that from the New York Times, and it will be historic. It will be a historic blunder. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Cooper.
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Deutsch, other distinguished members of the committee, thank you for having me, and I look forward to briefly summarizing a few key points from my written statement, which I should note are solely my own. In my statement, I note 4 problematic implications of not including missiles in the emergent nuclear deal with Iran being negotiated by the P5+1. One, most fundamentally, is raising troubling questions about Iranian intentions. And this is to a point that has been made by a number of you already, and that is that there is a very close correlation between longer range, meaning intermediate range and beyond ballistic missiles, and nuclear weapons power ambitions. And so at this moment, Iran is the only country in the world that says it has no nuclear weapons ambitions, and yet has fielded an intermediate range ballistic missile. The second is verification. Verification is something where historically we have had a lot of experience using delivery systems, and in particular missiles, as an object of verification, and have shown that it is possible to have very strong confidence in the ability to verify agreements that include provisions with restrictions and transparency on such systems, in contrast to a very patchy record of verification in terms of verifying nuclear fuel cycles and weapons programs per se. The third is breakout. It has been noted that nuclear weapons programs are a long-term process, even more so ballistic missile programs. In this respect, I should say, many horses are already out of this barn, but there's still an ICBM horse in the barn, at least for now. And that ICBM horse may well be the long pole in the Iranian tent in terms of being able to break out and become a full-scope nuclear power. And finally, undermining missile proliferation. And this has been said, and I would reinforce what has been said. It is going to be very challenging if Iran is perceived to be given a clean bill of nuclear non-proliferation health through this agreement to preserve the the missile non-proliferation regime, which we have traditionally so associated with nuclear weapons. And indeed, it has been an Iranian goal for decades to undermine the legitimacy of the very concept of missile non-proliferation. So it will be a tremendous challenge if this agreement goes through to preserve a robust missile non-proliferation regime against Iran and indeed more widely. Let me summarize by saying there are 3 acknowledged pillars to what a safer nuclear program looks like from a non-proliferation standard. 1, no indigenous enrichment or reprocessing. 2, open transparency, including full disclosure and resolution of past activities and an additional protocol in place with the IAEA. And 3, no associated weapons programs, and in particular, long-range ballistic missiles. The prospective P5+1 deal may prove to be a negative trifecta in all 3 of these areas. However, the ballistic missile area is the only one that it does not appear to even attempt to address. And that, I would say, again, is a very worrying indication that should raise questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. Dr. Kordsman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and the members of the committee. A lot of very good points have already been raised.
You could hold up your mic, put your microphone a little closer.
Members of the committee and the previous witnesses have already raised a number of very good issues, but I would like to briefly talk about Iranian motivation. It is important to remember this is a country coming out of missile wars with Iraq, the so-called War of the Cities, and I was in Iraq when I saw the Iranian side of this. It is also a matter of feeling of isolation, of having been attacked with chemical weapons, of seeing weapons of mass destruction as real, as something that affected troops and civilians. They look around and they see a very well-developed Israeli nuclear missile force, Pakistan, a Saudi missile force with Chinese-supplied missiles. They also see a rising confrontation between Sunni and Shiite. extremism of a Sunni kind countering extremism of their own kind. And you look at this environment and you ask yourself, are you going to be moving towards stability with or without a nuclear agreement? And you look at the history of START, of SALT, of our efforts to negotiate with North Korea. In every case, it turned into an ongoing duel. That duel is not ended with Russia. It still is a problem where we have not brought stability or security through the arms control alone. The other side of this, from an Iranian viewpoint, is that most of their conventional forces are old. Many were essentially systems which began to be deployed when I was serving in Iran. That was back in the early 1970s. They do not have an effective conventional force. They do have a very effective asymmetric warfare force. As has already been said, they can reach out very effectively to other countries, and they're doing that in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. These are very real issues, and one of the key aspects of being able to use those tools is to have the ability to deter retaliation, airstrikes, and capabilities which the Air Force and other forces can't provide. The problem they face is, frankly, much of their missile force, from short to long range, may on paper have accuracy, but in practice it is not reliable. It does not deliver accuracy in a form where a conventional warhead can be lethal except as an area strike weapon and a terror weapon. As Israelis have warned us, this is changing in the short-range dimension. It is technically far harder to produce real-world conventional precision strike capability than often people seem to understand technically. And twice we had to deploy systems knowingly that had nuclear warheads with conventional capabilities we claimed that did not exist. So that leads, I think, to my tangible suggestions to the committee. First, do not take any of the reporting you hear on a technical basis for granted. Quite frankly, if you don't, and General Flynn hinted at this, bring together intelligence experts versus policy spokesmen with people who actually have Q clearances and know about weapons design and actually work on missile design, you can get advice and technical data which is largely a matter of speculation. So one of the key issues is, how far has Iran moved toward a nuclear and precision strike option? And we've not seen a clear statement of this. Second, how well can you really verify missile and nuclear weapons progress in the future? I see two great dangers here. One, speculation on missiles based on the technical data of the guidance platform. This has never been a measure of real-world capability. You either know what the actual test data and derived aim point is, or you don't. The guidance platform accuracy does not tell you real-world performance. Second, there is a very wide range of nuclear weapons development activities which are extremely easy to conceal. Pakistan did that, and you ought to look at that model and not simply look, and I think witnesses have suggested this, at the fuel cycle. What do we really know about the statements they've had access to nuclear weapons design data? And here, having worked on this for DARPA, let me say that there are many people who talk about the ease of nuclear weapons design who are doing it on the basis of no practical experience whatsoever. You either have a Q clearance or you don't. There's only one kind of expert in this business, and that's somebody who's actually built a nuclear weapon. And even there, the agreements are not common. Second, if you don't have a limit to ballistic and cruise missile capabilities, and be careful here about cruise missiles, because they announced in March of this year a missile called the SUMAR, a cruise missile, supposedly precision strike, with a range of 2,000 kilometers. And just to put this in perspective, they've also launched Scud missiles from ships. So ICBMs is only part of this issue. In terms of any of this, can you really put a nuclear warhead on a missile without a fissile test? How much simulation can you actually carry out? How many missile tests do you need to get a derived aim point? And here again, if I were in the committee and somebody briefed me on guidance platform accuracy, I would become very impatient. There is a need for real-world examination of what the issues are. If there are nuclear agreements, and this has been raised by the committee, what kind of technology transfers will be opened up, and what kind of technology transfers matter? And these are not always obvious, since many of them are dual use. I think the mention has been made of North Korea. Let me note, without getting into the details, that there have been other experts who have commented that North Korea actually beginning to learn solid fuel technology in part from Iran. And these are areas where you need to look at the full rate of technology transfer as well as illegal purchases by Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Kordsman. I hate to be impatient myself, but if you could wrap it up.
Right, let me just finish with 2 points. First, what are our response options if things go wrong? That's a kind of obvious question to answer if you're going to have an arms control agreement. And then finally, don't focus too much on Iran. If you have this in parallel with North Korea, with China, which has recently been stated to be merving and creating a submarine launch capability, and tensions in Russia, and you're trying to think out of the box, what is the nuclear future threat we really have to deter and deal with? And let me just say, it isn't Russia anymore.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kordsman. And we will start the question and answer part of it. And listening to this expert testimony brings to light the concerns that many of us have with the nuclear negotiations because of what is not in the deal. The failure to incorporate Iran's ballistic missile program as part of the nuclear negotiations, the non-proliferation concerns that we now face in the region as a result of this nuclear deal and as a result of ignoring the ballistic missile threat, and the lifting of all of the sanctions at the UN, which will impact Iran's other illicit activities and will bolster the regime's pockets and will continue to attack U.S. interests as a result. So with that in mind, my one question is, can we fully understand the scope of Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear program without addressing the outstanding possible military dimension questions? And will we ever know fully the extent of the PMD aspect of it? General Flynn.
And I'll be very brief. So the latter part of your question, I don't think we can ever fully understand. We will never have perfect, what I call bulletproof intelligence on the capability that you just described. I do believe that as they move forward with this capability, they will not risk failure without testing themselves through either actual physical testing of the capability itself by firing it in the region, and also simulation components of testing. So I think we would see some of that, particularly if they decided to match an ICBM with a nuclear capability. So we would see some of that because they just would not risk failure of the system by just inadvertently launching something like that. So we would see some, but we would never know the full extent of it.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador?
Thank you. I think the IAEA has served an invaluable purpose for providing information and insights on the Iranian program. In November of 2011, they identified in their quarterly report 12 of these activities that are potentially related to a military dimension. And in fact, some of those activities, including the design on a warhead for a missile, are only related to weaponization. Since then, as you point out, the IAEA has been stonewalled by the Iranians. Iran has made repeated promises that they would come clean. Apparently, what's being negotiated now, I don't know what the final text will be, of course, but apparently we're going to accept yet another promise that they will come clean on these issues. My sense is, in order to understand the 12-month extension of, or expansion for breakout, you need to understand where that baseline knowledge is. And a critical component of that is how far Iran has come along on weaponization. We're just going to get one more promise, and my expectation will be that the Iranians will stonewall. And let me say, this is not just an IAEA implementation problem. This is a problem that directly relates to U.S. security.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Cooper?
Thank you. Obviously, I'll defer to General Flynn and Ambassador Joseph in their comments, with which I very much agree. I would make one other observation. I've approached this having been, as it were, in the trenches of this business for a couple of decades. And one thing I've experienced is that when a country has had nuclear weapons ambitions and makes a strategic decision to change course and to give them up, it's, in my experience, surprisingly easy for them to demonstrate that convincingly. That is not what this looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Kordsman?
First question, who is we? Because if we can't bring the P5+1 and the EU and other countries along with us with convincing arguments about violation, if verification is not transparent, having an internal U.S. understanding will not be enough. Second, the IAEA only can report to the extent that we and other countries report to them, and they can gain the data through inspection. Inspection is not an all-source approach to verification. The limits are extremely sharp. So one key question is, exactly what will the U.S. effort be and the Allied effort be to actually support the answer to your question? Finally, no, of course, we can't fully understand it, but we also need to be very careful about two things. First, their program is very marginal and very volatile, yet may not be predictable to them. In fact, it almost certainly won't be predictable to them. And finally, technicians and technocrats lie to autocratic leaders. And one of the great questions is going to be what level of risk and uncertainty is going to take place within Iran, and how well will they understand? Because that cruise missile I talked about probably was announced by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard without the authorization of the government, and in some ways to block the agreement. And that's not a sign of predictable unity.
Thank you very much. And as I recognize the ranking member for his question and answer period, I would like to ask Mr. Weber of Texas if he could take over the chair, as I have a speaking engagement in another building. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chairman. I wanted to follow up with the article that I referred to in my opening statement. The talks, all of these talks about the nuclear issue are premised upon the understanding that we've had that the sanctions with respect to support for terror, human rights violations, and ballistic missile production will all remain in place. Suddenly, the news this morning suggests that some have a different interpretation of why those ballistic missile sanctions were put in place to begin with. And I'd like to give our witnesses an opportunity to comment on this and why and how you respond to the suggestion that the only reason that those sanctions were put in place was to get Iran to the negotiating table to talk about the nuclear issue, not to continue to block them from developing ballistic missiles. Dr. Cordesman?
To be honest, I think one of the great problems is that sanctions don't block technology transfer at many levels anyway. What they do is put leverage on Iran. But when it comes to many of the missile improvements, these have taken place regardless of the limits and the existence of sanctions. They may have slowed down Iran and raised the cost. But as you pointed out, when you have countries like North Korea, when you have an industrial espionage network, you have to be very careful about how much of the actual technology transfer can be blocked. On the nuclear side, you could get a list of technologies that have been slowed down and presented problems. They responded in many ways by creating their own autonomous production capability. And so I think that, quite frankly, you've hit on a key risk, but the risk is not somehow that these sanctions are suddenly going to be raised in ways which increase the flow. They're going to increase, as other witnesses have said, the amount of money, the willingness of countries to basically ignore the consequence of their transfers, and they remove the leverage from Iran to at least show some degree of restraint.
Right. General Flynn, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, number one, I think I mean, once the sanctions are lifted, and as we've seen, I think since really 2013, the genie's out of the bottle. And you know, the phrase "snapback sanctions," that's wishful thinking. The big challenge that I think what has happened is that when this discussion was going, I don't believe that the administration thought that this region was going to spiral in the direction that it has spiraled as fast as it has, and I think that's a bit, you know, I wouldn't say it's caught us by surprise because it was known. So that's just another component of this thing. I think the third part about this is that the region should have been part of this discussion. So I got the P5+1, but there should have been along that path at least updates to the rest of the region, because the fourth thing, and we're already seeing it happen, and the specific numbers of Saudi, Jordan, the UAE, Kuwait, and Egypt already talking to the Russians and the Chinese about developing nuclear capabilities in their countries is a very real issue. And there's specific numbers to exactly what they're going to do over the next decade or so. So we're going to see proliferation in the region because we looked at this too narrowly from the beginning.
Can I go back, though, to your last point about what else is happening in the region? And I just ask all of the witnesses, to your knowledge, have any Iranian origin ballistic missiles or heavy rockets or launchers been captured at this point by ISIS or other extremist Sunni factions, either in Syria or in Iraq? Anyone have any response to that, thoughts on that?
I think you need to be careful because Syrian systems, which are virtually identical to Iranian systems, may have been. But if those transfers have occurred, I can only know of one site where that physically the Islamic State moved in, and I do not know whether they actually found anything.
And just finally, a quick question about the state of rocket manufacturing technology in Gaza and the extent to which the Iranians have been able to transfer the expertise necessary to have a full-fledged rocket development program in Gaza. Any thoughts? No.
Well, I'll just talk you know, from open source reporting that you know, in total violation of sanctions and in its typical behavior, Iran has continued to provide those capabilities as one or more of the members highlighted in their statements. So, and that continues to be a problem.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm going to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida.
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate you here being here and testifying on this important topic. It's kind of like the cat and mouse game that never goes away. General Flynn, you testified that there's no end in sight, no clear U.S. policy, no sufficient U.S. whole-of-government approach to address the crisis in Iraq. And just a few days ago, the President said that also, that there was no clear. Whose role is that to set that policy? Is that the military coming to us or the State Department, or is that should the President set a role and say, this is what we're going to do in those negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, that's got to start from the President. The President has to be very clear about what it is that we want to do. He then has to put the right structure, framework, people in place to accomplish that.
Okay, and I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I was stunned by his comments 2 days ago or 3 days ago. Stunned.
You know, and the people that come to me, they say it's either out of ignorance, incompetence, or by design. And I don't want to get into that, but it's not acceptable. You know, we're going into a negotiation trying to prevent that which we can't for that instead of preparing for that which will be. They're going to get a nuclear weapon, and we need to look at that day, unfortunately. Let me ask you, just shifting to the Iran and what's going on in Iraq. I read a report today that Iran, the Iraqi security forces used Iranian military equipment to advance in Mosul, I believe it was. In your opinion, is it possible with Iran having equipment in there and they're fighting not to be coordinating with U.S. troops or U.S. commanders? Is it possible to have two wars being conducted by two different countries fighting a common enemy?
I mean, wow.
We
have allowed this thing to get so out of kilt that it's hard for the forces that we have. I know for our military commanders, it's hard for them to figure out sort of which end is up and which direction do you want me to take there, Mr. President.
I agree. It's like you don't know what the left hand and the
Iran,
right hand are doing.
Iran is clearly doing the things that you just said, and they have Shia proxies, they have Shia militia, they have Iraqi military forces that are aligned underneath Shia leaders. I mean, this is a real big problem, and the likelihood of Iran dominating Iraq and the breakup of Iraq actually, I think is very real. I believe that we're not going to see that region go back to the way it was. I just don't believe that it's going to happen.
Ambassador Joseph, in your opinion, do you see a coalition of the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds forming a united Iraq that will stay together, or do you see more of it breaking up, as General Flynn said?
I agree with the General. I think you're likely to see more of a disillusion, more of a breakdown, and less unity than some have anticipated. I just think that the nature of the relationship between the Shia and the Sunni is such that there is no prospect, at least that I can see, for a peaceful resolution.
And I would like to see our foreign policy gravitate towards that, and let's not forget the lonely Kurds who are out there. And I think they all kind of want to have their own country is what I see, and I see a resistance to that. Dr. Joseph, you testified that the negative consequences of failure to include missile restrictions to deal with Iran are magnified by other flaws in negotiating powers towards Iran, including enrichment breakout. And we just heard a report the other day that, if I understood correctly, there's 20% more production of fissile material than there was before these negotiations started. Do you see this as a positive outcome in the Iran nuclear negotiation?
Well, I think there are a number of fatal flaws in our position, and in fact in what has already been agreed. I think the principal flaw is that we did permit Iran enrichment in the first place. Once you allow Iran to maintain, and in fact under this agreement expand, a large-scale infrastructure for enrichment, the agreement in and of itself explicitly recognizes at that point Iran as a nuclear weapons threshold state.
Right.
We've made concessions on verification. I do not believe that we are going to get what we need, which is unfettered, anywhere, anytime access to all facilities that are relevant, to all people that are relevant, and to all records that are relevant. We've made concessions in other areas, but I think those are the two principal ones.
I agree. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but not questions.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Mr. Connolly? I'm sorry.
I think Mr. Higgins is.
There we go, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Joseph, you had made reference to the breakout capability. We're told now that if Iran wanted to, they could pursue a nuclear weapon in a period of between 3 and 4 months. The framework for the agreement extends that time to at least a year, and some say conservatively so. You reject that, and why?
Yes, I do. I think that this notion of extending breakout to 12 months is another flaw. The reason is that we won't know when that 12-month clock begins, in all likelihood, unless Iran decides to break out at a monitored facility. The Iranians have proven themselves in this context to be masters of denial and deception. My sense is we won't know when that clock begins. Even if we knew when the clock began, does anyone really think that the international community will come together and have a determined response within that 12-month time frame? It's taken us over a decade to get where we are. And even if one assumes that we will know when the clock starts and the international community will come together, we don't have enough knowledge to understand where Iran is starting from. And that has to do with its stonewalling on those activities that are possibly related to the military dimension. It has to do with what Iran will have in terms of access to the low-enriched fissile material that is beyond the 300 kilograms that Iran would be allowed to have. Will they have ready access to that? Some administration spokespeople say it's going to go out of country. That would be great.
But now you're getting into verification. I just want to stay on this issue of capability relative to the reduction of infrastructure and material. And we are told that the combination of the two would deny Iran the ability to produce weapons-grade material because of the reduction of the material and the infrastructure.
Well, that's what we're told.
Right, okay.
That's what we're told. But let me say that if Iran today does not have a covert nuclear program, it would be the first time in 20 years. Yeah. We keep finding elements of a covert program, including enrichment facilities, okay, as we did with Fordo.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Let's say that there's not the ability to verify. We've been told by the administration that this plan is based not on trust, but on verification. And what you're saying is the history of covert activity by the Iranian regime makes that verification impossible?
Well, I think that given the absence of unfettered access to facilities, people, and records.
Is that issue fully resolved yet in the agreement?
The Supreme Leader has said it is. I mean, he's just one voice, but probably a very important voice in this. He has said that military facilities are off limits. He said that access to nuclear scientists are off limits. This is just a pattern. It's a pattern of deception. It's a pattern of covert activities in this area that Iran has demonstrated for more than 20 years.
So what would you suggest the alternative is?
Well, I would suggest that instead of relieving sanctions, we impose even more sanctions. It was sanctions that brought the Iranians to the table.
Would doing that keep the sanctions regime alive?
Well, I think it's
imperative. Would Russia and China fall off?
I think it's imperative to demonstrate U.S. leadership in order to keep those sanctions on Iran, to keep the pressure on Iran, and to insist on those elements that would make it an acceptable agreement, including effective verification. And I think with sanctions and with the restoration
An effective,
of a credible option for the use of force.
and I just want to be
Sorry.
clear, an effective verification would be unfettered access to all of Iran's nuclear facilities, including those that are controlled by the military.
That is an essential element of effective verification.
Okay, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now we'll go to Mr. Connolly.
I thank the chair and thank the panelists. Ambassador Joseph, you listed a series of foreign policy debacles. Maybe you overlooked weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the invasion of Iraq. Would that not be a debacle?
Sorry, I think it was certainly intelligence failure of the first order.
And would you not agree that, frankly, the occupation of Iraq was equally a debacle in that it led to the kind of chaos we've been managing for more than a decade?
Well, I think I think certainly we've had a decade of chaos in Iraq. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, but I mean, so it flows from some decisions we made. We didn't put enough troops in initially under the direction of the then Secretary of Defense. We stood by while looting and other crimes occurred because we didn't have enough troops to police, and it wasn't our mission. We de-Baathized the government, making a lot of government bureaucrats unemployed. We disbanded the military, creating a lot of disgruntled human beings who were armed that led directly to insurgencies. Is that not correct?
I think all of those things occurred, and I would say that compared to what I believe we're now headed into in terms of a bad agreement with Iran, those steps, as misfortunate as they have been, would rank much lower on the scale of foreign policy disasters than a bad nuclear agreement.
Well, no, you're comparing it now to the agreement, but you listed 3 debacles, all of which happen to be under a certain political party's administration. And I would just commend you that there are other debacles if we're going to get in that game. And the fact that you overlooked or didn't mention Iraq is quite striking, since most Americans, I think, would agree, in retrospect, it was a debacle.
Certainly there have been debacles under both parties, both administrations, and it wasn't playing a game, it was simply listing some.
It just struck me. You said to my colleague that the answer, and I want to make sure I get this correct, what you would recommend is pull the plug on this agreement or vote it down and actually impose more sanctions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, let me just, play devil's advocate with you for a minute, if you don't mind. So you obviously believe that would be efficacious. That would lead to desirable things and block or preempt the Iranians from pursuing undesirable things. But what if the opposite is true? What is the probability, do you think, that by pulling the plug and imposing more sanctions, the Iranians conclude it is totally without merit to try to negotiate with the West? Our P5+1 allies and partners, frankly, get disillusioned with that approach and will not cooperate with the imposition of more sanctions. Is that not a possible scenario, an undesirable outcome, though it is a probable outcome?
It's a possible scenario, absolutely.
But don't we need to weigh that before we take such action? I mean, don't we have to try to weigh what is the greater probability, an agreement that at least retards, rolls back some aspects of a nuclear development program versus an unintended consequence of actually an acceleration of that, because now the Iranians have concluded they have nothing more to lose, and our allies are disillusioned with our approach.
President Obama has said repeatedly that a bad agreement is worse than no agreement. And my sense is we are headed directly toward a bad agreement. So one has to weigh that as well.
Yes, but one also has to weigh the consequences of one's actions. And I was simply trying to engage you in, okay, while we're weighing, I mean, if you were the NSC advisor tomorrow, surely you'd have to do an analysis of the pros and cons of each approach. And the approach you've advocated for certainly is not without some risks, some very great risks potentially.
Well, there are risks all around.
Yes, I know.
I mean, there are risks in going forward with the bad agreement. I come at this, again, from a non-proliferation perspective.
Yeah.
I think this is going to light the torch for proliferation in the region. I think that not only will you have more states in the region going nuclear and acquiring more and more ballistic missiles, but you're likely to have a real negative impact on the NPT regime. And that's something we all need to care about.
I take your point, and it's a fair one, but I would simply suggest you, in the interest of intellectual honesty, one needs to examine whether your approach, with the best of intentions, actually leads to precisely the end result you want to avoid, massive proliferation. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm going to ask a couple of questions here. General Flynn, I'd like to hear you weigh in on the gentleman from Virginia's questions about the prior process of 10 years, that being a debacle, and is this one worse? What say you?
Yeah, I mean, I would, for Mr. Connolly, I would just offer that your counsel is actually very appropriate about previous decisions that we've made over the last 30-plus years of just huge strategic errors. I mean, and believe me, the majority of my career has been in that part of the world. So I don't disagree with anything that you said. This notion of proliferation, it is already happening. What I want this country to be able to do is I want this country to be in the driver's seat, okay? So I'm assuming that the deal is going to be done, bad deal, whatever it is. I'm assuming that. So now what I want is I want the United States of America to be in the driver's seat. I don't want Russia to be talking to Jordan about building nuclear plants. I don't want the Chinese or Pakistan to be talking to the Saudis about building potentially 10 to 15 plants. I don't want the Russians to go over to Egypt and talk to them about building nuclear plants. I want us to be in that driver's seat. Iran, I could go on and on all day about Iran and their behavior, and their lies, flat out lies. And then their spewing of constant hatred, no matter whenever they talk. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's a general or the Ayatollah himself. So what you're offering and what you said is exactly right. It's counsel to say, okay, let's assume some things are going to happen. Let's assume this is going to occur. Now what do we do about it? And let's project forward. Let's look forward, because I rhyme and verse on the decisions to go into Iraq, done deal, and where it's potentially led us today. I got it. But now we have to figure out what is happening. And I'm telling you, because I read the regional news all the time, every day. And I just came from a fairly extensive trip to the Middle East. And this was one of the big issues that came up. And they're already talking. I mean, you had the Crown Prince of Saudi already in Korea, already talking to the French about nuclear development. I mean, Jordan, probably the closest, they're our closest friend, right? Or certainly they believe that we're their closest friend. They're talking to the Russians about this business, about nuclear development. So we have to get very, very smart, and we have to do it very quickly, because it is going to happen. Be for it, because it is nuclear proliferation in this region, and it will happen. What we want to do is we want to keep it at the nuclear energy level and not nuclear weaponization level. And that, to me, is something that I believe this country, our country, can actually lead on and make happen.
Thank you, General. Ambassador Joseph, you said earlier in your exchange with Mr. Higgins that we won't know for sure on a breakout when the clock begins. And is it a 3 or 4, I think he asked, is it a 3 or 4 months breakout? Is it a year breakout? Is that really your opinion, that the clock hasn't begun on that breakout?
Well, I think my point is that we don't know. Maybe it already has. But I'm just looking at experiences in the proliferation, non-proliferation area. We were caught off guard by the timing of the Soviet first test. We were caught off guard by the Chinese first test, by the timing. We were caught off guard, as the chairwoman mentioned earlier today, about the uranium enrichment program in North Korea. And that's with advanced collection capabilities. We just won't know, and that's the problem here. We just don't know.
Well, forgive me, but I think that that clock is ticking. We really don't know. I mean, by all the testimony here today of all of this stonewalling they've done. So the gentleman from Florida alluded or mentioned the 20% increase in fissile material. You've read those reports. Are they accurate in your opinion?
I think they're accurate. They're from the IAEA, who monitors this, and keeps very good track of it. Absolutely.
All right, so have you asked yourself this question? If they've increased the fissile material by 20%, their technology and perhaps even their infrastructure has probably been increasing and improving at the same time?
There's just no doubt it's been increasing. I mean, under this agreement, there are no restrictions, as far as I know, on research and development of advanced centrifuges. And the next generation is, I'm told, 4 times more efficient than the previous one. So, you know, again, there are all of these loopholes in the arrangement as they're being worked out.
And General Flynn, you said the Iranians will not risk failure without testing in your earlier comments. So what you're saying is that at some point we're going to see them test an ICBM. Is that correct?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that they will do that. They will test whether they actually move to nuclearization of that capability. We will eventually see them doing some of that, and they've already taken some steps to do that.
So don't they have? Wouldn't you imagine they have that same calculus that? And when they do that testing, they better be very, very close to their breakout. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, all you have to do is look at the North Korea example.
Okay, Ambassador Joseph, would you agree with that as well?
Yes, fully agree.
Dr. Cooper, would you agree with that?
Yes.
Dr. Korsman? Okay, fair enough.
I mean, technically, warhead design is very different from how you're defining breakout. And you have to make a very clear distinction between having a nuclear device or event.
Well, but you also said, forgive me for interrupting, that what do you say, technocrats lie to technicians and technocrats lie to autocrats. And so if they've misled us up to this point, and I get that there's a technological difference in that design, but if they're going to show that they have ICBM capability, I have to believe that they're going to be just like your 3 colleagues there, that they are so close, they would not risk letting us know that they have that capability unless they were on the threshold. And we're just going to have to agree to disagree about that. I'm out of time. I appreciate your response. And I'm going to go to gentleman, Mr. Mark Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your testimony. So the Iranians have said that their nuclear advancement is for peaceful purposes. Is that correct? So I see nodding. Is there any peaceful reason to have an ICBM? Dr. Cooper.
Thank you very much. This raises a very interesting question. And the peaceful version of an ICBM is a space launch vehicle. That is the dual use aspect of this. And the Iranians have been extremely cagey recently. They went from announcing a very ambitious space launch program, which was widely interpreted as a cover for an ICBM program, as has been mentioned. There have been a number of statements recently that suggest they don't want an ICBM, and even that they are modifying or even shutting down their space launch program. I think the key here, given the intersection of space launch technology and missile technology, this is really where we have a missed opportunity from this negotiating process. Even if the Iranians were not willing to consider restrictions on any of their programs, it is a pity that we did not even get transparency so that we could understand the nature of their space launch program, which is a very opaque program.
So Dr. Cooper, what you're saying is that if indeed it was for peaceful purposes, we could come in with regards of raising this issue of ICBMs and determine very quickly whether it is a space launch aspect that they're really pursuing or perhaps preparing for nuclear capability. And I'll come to you. Dr. Cooper, do you want to speak to that? And then Dr. Kordsman, I'll come to you.
There are junctures where a space launch program and a military ICBM program separate and are distinguishable, but they're very late in the day. And most
By very late, you quantify that for a layman on a scale of 1 to 10, with that being able to be a deliverable, 10 being the highest in terms of deliverable. Is that at stage 7 or 8, or is that at 5?
I am not technically proficient enough to try to quantify it at that level, but it is relatively late in the process, and a lot of the heavy lifting technologically can occur within the same sort of program that you would have for an SLV program. It's precisely for this reason that the United States and its partners within the Missile Technology Control Regime do not distinguish between space launch vehicles and missile programs. They merely talk about the capabilities of any unmanned system capable of delivering a 500-kilogram payload to 300 kilometers, which is a very low threshold.
And Dr. Kortzman, welcome back. You were on a panel just a couple of days ago, so welcome back. But do you want to respond to that?
It's more a supplement to Dr. Cooper's remarks than anything else. They have been very cagey about what they've been doing, but they have also built a very large new test facility, and they have created a much larger launch pad capability. They did have an accident, which was very serious and to some extent delayed part of their program. But I think you will find that when it comes down to what they can do, they are making significant advances in the space program that have a direct correlation to the kind of booster tests you would need for an ICBM. And I think those physical indicators are very much something that you need to pay attention to.
So it's your professional opinion that they could be developing truly the deliverables for a nuclear warhead on a parallel track while working on their space program. Is that correct? If I'm hearing you correctly?
Certainly, because we know that countries like Pakistan with a much lower technology base did it 15 to 20 years ago.
Right.
And the Parsham facility is something they would not have to rebuild. They could probably simulate or create that facility in far less detectable ways. Once they do that, here I would have to question one aspect of what Ambassador Solomon said. I'm not sure that any amount of verification would give you the capability unless you had a major intelligence leak.
All right. So, General Flynn, let me come to you with my final question as I'm running out of time. You're an expert in the region. You've spent much of your life there. I have an ex-CIA officer that gives me intel. He's retired now. He was in the region, both in Pakistan and Israel. And so his assertions are that when we talk about proliferation, is that there has been a real desire to acquire nuclear capability by some of these member states for many years, dating back to 1999 and 2000. Would you concur with that, and that we're about to embark on a nuclear arms race in the Middle East that we have not seen the likes of ever?
Yeah, no. So we are embarking. We have embarked on a nuclear race in the Middle East. Now, arms, from everything that Iran has said, they have every intention of having a nuclear weapon. They have stated it, and if I've learned anything about some of the threats that we face, is if they say it, they typically try to do it.
Sure.
So, and I agree with Dr. Kortzman. I mean, this is a difficult thing to do, but some of the things that we've already seen them do over the last 5-6 years for their space program, and both liquid and solid propellant systems that they have. I mean, they've done some leap ahead things that make them more ready today than they ever were, and the time to get there, as the chairman was highlighting, is a lot shorter than we probably will estimate.
Thank you, General Flynn. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your generosity on the time. I yield back.
You're more than welcome. And I'd like to just note, by the way, that the only thing we haven't heard the Iranians say is that they're from the government and they're here to help us, number one. And number two, do we know of any other nation that has announced they're going to do a space program while their leadership chants death to Israel and America? I just want to make those two comments. Good questions from the gentleman from North Carolina. At this time, we're going to go to the gentleman from Alabama, Chairman Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Admiral Joseph, good to see you here again. I want direct my questions to you. I'm beyond nuclear weapons. I'm concerned about what other weapons of mass destruction Iran may have. Are you familiar with the latest so-called, quote, compliance report, close quote, from the State Department that indicates the United States cannot confirm Iran is complying with its obligations under the Biological Weapons and Chemical Weapons Conventions?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. What kind of verification, weapons verification, do we need to know exactly what Iran would be deploying on its ballistic missiles, in your view?
Well, that's a tough question. As I mentioned, unfettered access anywhere, anytime, facilities, people, records, that's an essential component, but it's certainly not sufficient in and of itself. We would have to, I think, have a very intrusive approach to the ballistic missile development in Iran, and I think it would have to be designed uniquely for Iran. I don't know that there's been much thought to that. So what we do is we look for testing. We use all source intelligence to try to understand the various parameters of the various missile programs. But as far as I can tell, there's no effective verification structure currently in place, unless, of course, Iran does something very obviously and tests in the open.
Well, Ambassador, are you concerned that they do have biological and chemical weapons capability that they could put on their ballistic missiles? I am concerned. I'm more familiar on the chemical side than I am on the biological side, but I think that's a real risk that exists in the region, which of course makes it imperative on us for our forces and for our allies to be prepared for all contingencies. On that front, this be for the Ambassador or General Flynn. What kind of missile defense capability does the U.S. need to deploy for itself and its allies to be able to defend against literally hundreds and hundreds of Iranian ballistic missiles and terrorist proxies that the Obama-Iranian sanctions relief negotiations will enable?
Yeah, I mean, we have very specific capabilities in the surface-to-air missile, sort of toolbox, but also our Air Force and Naval Air that's out there in the theater most of the time, our aircraft carriers that bring an entire array of sort of defeat capabilities. And also in the Eastern Mediterranean is another area where we have continued to keep certainly a Marine amphibious task group out there for a long period of time. So we have an array of capabilities. I believe that, in fact, I know because they have told me in the Sunni Arab leader community, one of the things that they do want out of this whole thing is an assurance, more of a guarantee than just a handshake, that the United States will be there for the long term to basically provide that kind of an umbrella that you're talking about, that you're asking about.
Mr. Chairman, could I just add to that one point, and it's a point that I know you feel very strongly about, and that is the need to do more to protect the homeland against an ICBM-class threat from Iran. 44 ground-based interceptors in Alaska simply won't do it. We canceled the original third site. We've canceled Phase 4 of the European phased adaptive approach. We need to do more to protect the United States against this emerging threat.
Yeah, and this really sad news is I was in Fort Greely 2 weeks ago. We don't even have 44 interceptors yet. We're still working toward that. A last question, and this could be for anybody. Do y'all believe the United States can use Iranian assets currently under control of the U.S. to pay for such capabilities? Legally, I don't know, or politically? All right, I guess we don't know. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I appreciate it. That's the first time I've seen a panel stump, so good job. Dr. Cooper, what are the agreed upon, if there is any, the number of centrifuge Iran needs for a peaceful nuclear program? Ambassador, do you know the number we agreed upon in their negotiations?
In the negotiations, what has been reported in the press is somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. I believe that it's 5,000 at Natanz and another 1,000 centrifuges.
Okay, let me ask you this, and do you need more centrifuges for a peaceful nuclear program versus a nuclear weapons program?
Well, of course, it all depends on the number of nuclear reactors for which you're trying to develop the fuel. The Iranians say they need 100,000 centrifuges spinning because they have plans for many, many more.
The way I understand it is you need hundreds of tons or tons of fissile material for reactors, whereas a bomb, you need kilograms.
That's right.
So you would need more for a peaceful nuclear program, yet we're limiting them on the very things that we need. So, you know, it doesn't smell right. Let's see. What would need to happen in the Middle East to bring a stop to the nuclear arms race in the Middle East? Lieutenant General?
Yeah, it's not going to happen. I mean, the nuclear, the movement to nuclear capabilities in the Middle East is happening as we sit here today. So this is irreversible.
Ambassador Joseph, what do you feel like?
I have to agree with the general, but what I would hope, and hope is seldom a sound basis for a strategy, but I would hope that the United States could restore the credibility of its security commitments in the region. I think that's an essential element. Again, it may not be sufficient, but it is essential if we're going to make progress.
And it's a start, and that's something we have to do. I mean, and I've only been here for a little over 2 years, but what I hear is the credibility of the United States, especially from our allies, is number one, they don't know if they can rely on us. They don't know if they can depend on us. And of course, we know what our enemies say. They don't really, they don't fear us or respect us. And I really don't care if they respect us, but they should. I don't want them to fear us, but they need to know we mean what we say. We talked a lot about verification in the IAEA, and we know what a cat and mouse game Iran's played for the last 30 years. It doesn't work. There's new technology out there. You guys familiar with the anti-neutrino technology and the waterways of picking up? They can triangulate where nuclear reactors are or weapons. They can pick that up. That's doable technology, correct? No comments?
There's just, I mean, those are kinds of, that sort of stuff you're going to have to address with other committees.
All right, I will. But the technology's out there. I've done a lot of research into it, and somebody said, well, it's not doable yet. And I understand that, because at one point the nuclear bombs weren't doable, but it was there in theory. This nation rallied around that to make that happen. I say we need to rally around the research and development of the anti-neutrino detector plates to find out where these are so we don't have to depend on Iran coming clean. And it is anywhere, everywhere detection at all times. And I think this is something for the United States. Ambassador Joseph, you said we need to prepare. We need to do a better job on national security. And I think this is a paramount, and we'll pass it on to the different committees. With that, I yield back, and thank you for your time.
I thank the gentleman. Okay. Well, it looks like we've exhausted all of our questions. We appreciate y'all's testimony, and our hearing is adjourned.